Okay, this is apparently rural tropics, and it might be rural, but it's definitely not tropics up here. Terrific. Thanks, Mel, for hosting us, and Jess for organising, and everyone for turning up. It's great to see a lot of faces here, so terrific. So my subject that I've been given is to talk about all things philodendron, and probably if I talked about all things philodendron, we might be still here in a week or two's time, but I'll endeavour to keep it within a time limit so that we can have some lunch. But just for those that don't know me, and I know a lot of the people here already, but there's a few faces that I don't know. I'm a former committee member of the Aroid Society, and before Jess I was the state representative, and I handed the baton over to her now. And you know, I've been growing philodendrons for over 40 years, so I've got a little bit of knowledge stored in there, but it's like anything, you always keep learning, and there's always something to pick up. So essentially I'm just going to go through a few different topics as far as philodendrons concerned, a little bit of general information about them, a little bit about the history, some information about the structure of the plants, a little bit about pollination, propagation, etc. So a few sort of, I guess, I'm going to cover the various aspects of philodendrons. First point is that they're the second largest genus in the Araceae family. So out of all of the aroids, they have the second most number of species. Can anybody tell me which genus has the largest number? Mm-hmm, correct. It is Anthurium's top, philodendron second, but that's quantity is not quality. That's what they tell me anyway. So philodendrons are exclusively neotropical, and what that means is that they come from the New World, not from Europe, not from Asia, in this case Central and South America. There are around 500 published species of philodendrons, and the botanists estimate that there might be another 200 out there in the wild. I suspect that they're grossly underestimated it, and that there's more likely well over 1,000 philodendron species through there. And that's not counting the different forms. I don't know if any of you have sort of been following the number of different forms of Varicoseum that have come onto the market. Not a lot of them have hit Australia yet, but certainly in America there's at least 50 different forms of Varicoseum being grown. So quite prolific in that sense. There's a lot of morphological. Now there's going to be a few botanical terms thrown in here, so if you don't know what they mean, put your hand up and ask. But there's quite a morphological diversity, and that essentially means in the morphology of the plant, the leaf shapes, sizes, etc. So the closest relative, you know, all of the different families, all of the different genus or genera of aroids, there's one particular family that is the closest relative to philodendron. So anyone have an idea off the top of their head what that might be? You can't answer. Sorry? Well, I'll come back onto Thaumatophyllum, because that may be the answer, and it may not be the answer. But sorry, what were you saying? No, it's not Rhaphidophora. Okay, it is what used to be the Homolomena of the Americas, because there's Homolomena in Asia as well. Now, recently those Homolomena of the Americas have been taken into a new genus called Adelonema. Right? So the Adelonemas are actually the closest relative to philodendrons. So they're mostly found in the Amazonian and Atlantic rainforests of South and Central America, and they occupy a number of other niche habitats as well, including freshwater swamps, stream banks, regrowth forest, rock outcrops and roadsides. They're good colonisers of roadsides. When roads have been cleared, the philodendrons like colonising that extra little bit of sunlight. And typically they constitute one of the most conspicuous elements of the vegetation in these forests due to their abundance, the climbing habit, and frequently the very large and showy leaves that they have. So as far as a range goes, I don't know if you remember much of your geography from school, but northern Mexico, all the way down through Central America, through your Nicaraguas and Panama, etc., down into South America and all the way to the south of Uruguay. So we're actually just at the top of Argentina. So that whole range is all philodendron range. So it's very diverse in terms of the geographical spread. And then you've got the elevations. Well, the elevations of these plants will grow in is from sea level to well over 2,500 metres. Now, just to give you an idea, a collection of Philodendron Varicoseum was made at an elevation of 2,500 metres, which is higher than Mount Kosciuszko. So to give you an idea that these plants are growing in the cloud forest, essentially, cool, constant mist, and some of these collections are very difficult for us to grow and reproduce as a result of the conditions that they're originally from. So unless you've got sort of almost like a refrigerated space, constant mist, you're kidding yourselves if you think you can grow successfully some of these really delicate cloud forest type species. So we've now got another botanic term, infrageneric. So anyone have a guess at what infrageneric might mean? Within the genus, yes. Okay, very good. So the classification within the genus is that there are 3 subgenera, and these particular categories are all essentially divided by the characteristics of the plants within them. So imaginatively, the first subgenera they called Philodendron. So you've got Philodendron, subgenera, Philodendron, okay? The next one is one called Pteramycium, and the Pteramycium philodendrons are probably, they only account for about 15% of the species. The subgenera Philodendron has about 80%. So very few Pteramycium philodendrons are grown in a cultivated sense. They're not very showy, and what they lack is cataphyls. Okay, so your general philodendron will have eventually reach cataphyl growth when it matures, and you know the immature growth of the new leaf coming out of the petiole of the old leaf in this subgenera Pteramycium, that continues through the whole life of the plant, so it never matures into a cataphyl. So that's the second subgenera, and the third subgenera is the Meconostigma philodendrons, which some botanists have carved off into the new genus of Thaumatophyllum, and another group of botanists have said, hey, that's not right, you shouldn't be doing that. So it's currently a dispute. It's like it's botany war, and essentially one group is saying, yes, they deserve to be carved off, and this other group saying, no, we don't agree with it. Because then if you carve that off, you should be carving off Pteramycium as well. So it's a bit of a Mexican standoff. I've sort of jokingly said that we should just get all of these botanists, put them in a room, lock the door, and don't come out until you agree whether it's going to be. We could well be dead by then. I think you're possibly right. So getting botanists to agree. So at the moment, it's safe to call it a philodendron, and it's also safe to call it a Thaumatophyllum. So it's a bit of a botanical divide, I suppose. And Meconostigma, if they are still philodendrons, there's only about 5% of the species belong to that. So subgenera Philodendron has, roughly 80% of the numbers. So if we talk a little bit about how Philodendron as a name for the genus came about, a little bit of the history. The first collections of what we now know as philodendrons came back from South America to Europe. The first one's in 1693 by a collector called Charles Plumiere. He got them from Martinique and elsewhere, and they were originally described as arums. Okay, so then the famous Swedish botanist Linnaeus, he decided that not all aroids belonged in the same genus, and so a process of creating new aroid genera began. But it wasn't until the Austrian botanist Heinrich Wilhelm Schott began working on aroids, did the taxonomy of the whole aroid group begin to get straightened out. Schott had spent 4 years in Brazil, so he had a pretty decent understanding of the aroids that were present there. And when he returned to Vienna in 1821, he set to work. He was also I think the director of the local botanic gardens. 1829, he published what we know today as Philodendron, albeit it was originally spelled Philodendrum, as in bang the drum. But that soon got changed. In 1832, he published a preliminary classification of the Aracea and included the first infrageneric classification of Philodendron.
What's the type species for Philodendron?
I don't know the answer to that one, sorry. I don't know. I'd have to look it up to see which is the type. But Schott subdivided the genus into the 3 groups that are still recognised today. So a lot of this early botanical work is still very much valid. Another Austrian, Endlicher, produced a revision in 1837 with the help of Schott, and in 1841 Kunth published a species-level revision that also included new species. Then Schott published his Synopsis Aroidearum in 1856, and that was a whole species-level revision of the genus. He then did more work in 1860 and passed away in 1865. Then Adolf Engler, a German botanist, took up Schott's work and refined it, published a revision in 1899, and a further one was published with another German botanist, Karl Kraus, in 1913 as Das Pflanzenreich. And this remains the most recent revision of the whole genus. Okay, so you have to go back to 1913 to find a revision of the full revision of the genus. Since that time, there have been part revisions of certain sections of it, but no one has ever. There's been a revision of the Meconostigmas, as an example. Various botanists have done part revisions, but there's still no full, total revision of the genus. So botanists like George Bunting, Paul Stanley, Matuda, Tom Graham, Simon Mayo, Dr. Tom Croat, all of these guys are really highly regarded aroid botanists and made great contribution to philodendron knowledge. And in recent years, the South American botanists have gotten much more interested in their local endemic flora, and botanists like Eduardo Gonçalves, Cassius Sakurai and Luisa Calazans are prominent today. And a lot of these names you'll actually see in species, like there's Stanley, Stanleyana as an example, Mayo-i, there's a Crotii. So a lot of the botanists name plants after other botanists. When they run out of ideas of what to call a plant. So hope you like my model here that's assisting me today. This is Miss Florida. what I wanted to just run through are the basic elements of the plant. A number of you will know this terminology already, but essentially stem, that's not a terribly difficult one. They haven't come up with a really complicated botanical name for that one yet, at least not one that's come into popular use. Petiole. A lot of people call that a leaf stem. Well, petiole is a name that doesn't confuse it with any other structure. In the case of Florida, with its two parents of squamiferum and pedatum, it has this nice red, rough surface on the petiole. Then we go to the leaf blade itself. Here on Florida, the leaf blade is quite divided, but you have an abaxial side, which is the back, and an adaxial, which is the front of the front of the leaf. And then we look along the stem, and we see, for example, here is the axillary bud, and this bud, as it happens, is let's say compared to this one down here that you can see, that hasn't activated at all. This one has started to activate. So essentially, that's where new shoots come from off the stem. The next item is the cataphyll, and the cataphyll essentially is the cover of the new leaf, and within the cataphyll is the next cataphyll, and if you keep going, within that next cataphyll is the next cataphyll, and so on and so on. So essentially that's the growth mechanism of the plant, and as we all know, that's what you've got to protect. If that gets damaged, then your next number of leaves are going to be damaged as well. And then finally we come to the flower. The technical term for it is an inflorescence in philodendrons, and these come either singly or in multiples. Okay, this is the leaf axil that the flowers come out of. If you sort of look closely, you'll see a little fold, a little groove in there, and the flower comes out. But it's not actually a structure of the leaf, it's actually a structure of the stem. So if I was to be very rude to Mel's plant here and chop off the leaf, the flowers would you'd actually see them coming out of the stem, and that's why when you see a leaf stem, you'll actually see the hole through which the flower grows out of the stem. So it's not a leaf structure, it's a stem structure. So the flower itself, or the inflorescence, this structure that holds the flower up, some are very short and some are quite long. That's called a peduncle. Now that's a very interesting, like ped with uncle at the end of it. So I don't know what your uncles are like, but so the peduncle holds up the flower, and the flower's made of generally two components. The outer structure is called the spathe, and that when it opens is sort of like the hood, and within it is the vertical spadix. And the spadix structure has, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but that's sort of the key to making crosses and eventually getting seeds. So the next structure I just wanted to cover briefly.
Sorry.
Yes?
What triggers flowering?
Look, it can be seasonal, and I think in habitat, I think the flowering is seasonal. I find in my greenhouse that I will have flowers pretty much all year round. on different plants. It won't be the same ones necessarily, but I can pretty well guarantee that even in winter I'll have open flowers. So it certainly is there's a maturity factor in there, that you won't get a flower in a very juvenile plant, so it has to reach a certain level of maturity. And some philodendrons in my collection I've never flowered and may never. So it's not anything that you can guarantee. And then when you do get a flower on one that you didn't think you were going to, then it's a little bit of a cause for celebration. You enjoying that bird? Thanks. Okay. So just want to talk a little bit about extra floral nectaries, and everyone hopefully has some idea of what I'm talking about, because an extra floral, that sounds very fancy, but all that really means is that it's a nectary outside of the flower, okay? It's not a flower structure that's producing nectar, it's another structure on the plant. And generally they're found on the leaf blade, on the petiole, on the cataphyll, and on the spathe. So they're generally the 4 locations, and essentially they occur in different patterns on different species. What? Extra floral nectaries, yes. You can see. Well, you can certainly see on the leaf blade all of those little dark green dots are essentially nectaries. I can see some here because I'm close up to this plant. I can see some on the various flower structures here, and essentially they're just little dots, if you like, that produce a very sweet, sugary nectar, if you like, and that essentially attracts ants. I mean, I see ants. I don't know about you, Mel, in your greenhouse. You see ants all over your plants, and especially going up to get a little bit off the extra floral nectaries. In Amazonian Brazil, the natives have a name for a particular philodendron, and it's the same name as they use for ants. Right? So it's interesting how the two very much coexist. Just we'll continue onto the inflorescences and pollination now. So the aroid flower, as I said before, is a spathe and a spadix. So the spadix, the vertical structure in the middle, has 3 sections to it. Male flowers at the top, a sterile section in the middle, and female flowers at the bottom. Philodendrons are one of the few plants that use a process called thermogenesis. And thermogenesis is actually a mechanism by which the flower heats up. So in some, especially the Meconostigma / Thaumatophyllum group of philodendrons, the heat produced by these flowers can be up to 15 degrees Celsius higher than the ambient temperature. So they can get up to 35 degrees Celsius. You put your hand, especially on the spadix when it's open, and you can really feel the heat. The regular philodendrons do it as well, but not to the same degree as the Meconostigma ones. And essentially what that does is that helps volatilize the chemicals in the flower, and they send that volatile chemical message out into the open air, and the pollinating insects smell that, get attracted, and then they come through and do their business over all of the flowers. Now, the pollinating insects for philodendrons are generally one particular type of insect. Anyone care to guess what sort of insects they might be?
Flies? Bees, maybe?
No, not bees. Not ants. Beetles, yes, beetles. I'll transgress to a little story. One of Charles Darwin's, I think it was Charles Darwin's colleagues, who's quite a famous ecologist, and he was asked a question about his study of nature. What does that tell him about God? Because in those days, God was still very much a part of the whole consideration. And this guy said, well, he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles. That's what his study led him to believe, because there are so many species of beetles. There are literally tens of thousands of different species of beetles. So in situ, in South America, beetles are the prolific pollinators, and there's lots of photographs, and they'll eventually eat, after they've got the male pollen off, they'll end up actually eating the top of the spadix off. So many beetles on there. So we've talked about thermogenesis and how that heats up and how it sends a message out. So the pollen is obviously the critical aspect to pollinating. Okay, the pollen is produced out of the top half of the top male section of the flower, usually on the second night of the flower opening, and it's often accompanied by resin shedding as well, and that's sort of a reddish orange. I don't know if you looked at any of Mel's flowers that she's been working in the greenhouse, because she's pollinated a number, and you'll actually see on the top of the spadix this very red, sticky, and that generally accompanies the pollen shedding. In some species, all you see is resin. Okay, some species have a very poor pollen shed and are very difficult to pollinate as a result, or to use their pollen to pollinate others. The resin actually helps the pollen stick to the beetles, essentially. So that's one of the reasons why it's there.
Can you freeze the pollen?
Look, yes, you can freeze the pollen, and you can certainly put it in the fridge. It's best to use it fresh. I used some fresh the other day, and I got an instant result. I had a pollen shed here, had an open flower here, put the two together, and like the next day it clearly worked. So it's much better fresh.
What was it that made you think that it clearly worked?
Well, look, it was it obviously went green. Once the female parts of the flower down the bottom go green, if they go brown, that's just in the process of decay. So the green, you need that green colour. So essentially the system is designed that you can't pollinate a flower from that one flower. So you need a pollen from another flower to be able to pollinate this flower. So if this one opens first and I don't have any pollen to pollinate it with, all I can do is wait for the pollen to be sent off in the second night, and then I've got pollen that I then have to wait for this next flower over here to open. And if that's a matter of weeks, well, my only choice is to put the pollen in the refrigerator. But if I've got another plant over here whose flower opens at the same time as this one, and its female parts are receptive, because the female flowers at the bottom are only receptive for that first night. Okay, they're not receptive at the same time as the pollen is being shed, so they make it difficult for you. So pollinating philodendrons is much more tricky than anthuriums.
So the pollen comes off of the spadix,
Mm-hmm.
and then where on the flower do you reapply?
You reapply it down the bottom.
Right.
Okay, so the female, what you'll need to do is that you'll need to actually snip off very delicately with a pair of nail scissors or something similar to peel off the spadix. Peel the spathe away from the spadix, and then you'll clearly see at the base the female flowers that you need to then rub the pollen into.
And do you use your hands or fluid?
You can do either. I do it with my hand more often than anything else, so it works, and it sort of partly depends. The resin,
Yeah, like is it hard to get the pollen?
yes,
Got all that resin?
yeah. Some pollen sheds don't have much resin in them, and other ones do. The Meconostigma thaumatophyllum ones, the pollen shed is amazingly. It goes like, you know, those guards. The beef, is it the beef eaters or no, you know, the ones at Buckingham Palace with that's how the top of the spadix goes. It just goes poof, with pollen, and the pollen will be, you know, half a centimetre long.
Yeah.
You know, that's how much will be sort of around it. But on a little philodendron flower like this, the amount of pollen is pretty negligible.
Yeah, I can imagine it hard then when you're battling with resin. to
Yes,
get it
yeah, and you
to,
kind of got, if you
yeah.
bring it out of the fridge, you've got to kind of let it warm up a little bit to be able to apply it. Otherwise, it's like
yeah,
it's too hard. So
very different to anthurium.
it's a very different process to anthuriums, and so crossing philodendrons is a lot harder, but I think it's probably a little bit more rewarding as a result of, I guess, the difficulty. So as Jess was referring to, when does it become apparent? Well, within at least a day or two, I can kind of tell if it's been successful or not. If the colour turns green, and then it will just get greener, and then it'll start to swell a little bit, and then it begins the ripening process. So it can be 3-4 months process from pollination to actually ripening, and then it'll be squishy. It gets to the stage where it's, you know, it's ripe like any fruit, because ultimately that's what it is. It's a fruit, and all of those individual little female flowers that are within the greater inflorescence all turn into a berry, and within that berry there might be 8, 10, 12 or more seeds. So even out of a little philodendron flower like that, you might end up with 1,000. You might end up with 1,000 seeds. But the smaller the flower, the smaller the seed, and they're almost, you know, some of them are very, very small. The thaumatophyllum seeds, though, are the largest. The flowers are the largest, and the seeds are the largest as a result. So, and then you've got to clean them. They all come with a little, you know, they come out of the berry with a little sort of gelatinous sac, and you kind of got to get that off all of them to be able to have a good chance of growing. And I think a number of people are growing seeds of various plants, and these guys are really no different. You just want to make sure that they don't dry out.
How are the beetles able to pollinate them in nature if the spadix is covering the female part?
Well, it's covering the female parts in a sense, but they can sort of kind of climb down, and different philodendron species have different, I guess, the amount that some of the spadixes or spadices will come out at an angle, and others stay at a sort of a more vertical tilt. And some of the ones that come out at an angle, they really open up around the female parts. So it's quite accessible for beetles to be able to do that. So I've talked a little bit about propagation and seed. Vegetative is the main, I guess, the main mechanism by which, you know, some of these plants are best propagated by, because, you know, if you're trying to propagate them by seed can take a long time, and, you know, if you've got a vegetative cutting, it's going to be true to the plant that you've taken it from. So I think everyone here is experienced enough that they're growing plants from cuttings. My personal preference is to use sphagnum moss. That's the material that I've used to strike my cuttings in over the years. And essentially I make a little hothouse, put my sphagnum moss into a pot, put my cutting into the sphagnum moss, generally a little bamboo stick, and then into a Ziploc bag. And that's a little humidifier, humidity crib, if you like, for the cutting. Some people prefer to use perlite, and some people like to strike their cuttings in water. It's really what works for you. So if you go through a little bit of a experiment, try different methods, you'll find ones that seem to work better for you. So some people stick them straight into soil or aroid mix, and sometimes they strike that way as well. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's what works for you, essentially.
What conditions do you need for the seeds to germinate?
Well, look, you essentially need warmth and humidity. Yeah, well, light's important, but you know, I'd generally be having them in some sort of enclosed, like a takeaway container. Those sorts of things are pretty good. You can get other sorts of clear plastic things that have lids on them. What are they called? Yeah, but there's more Tupperware sort of, you know, there's more fancy ones. Decor make them, you know, those sorts of things. So yes, you can use them. Or yes, you know, even those seed raising trays with a little lid, you can put them in there. But essentially, yeah, you've just got to make sure that they don't dry out.
Would you use sphagnum as well?
Yes, I chop up the sphagnum, make sure it's sort of quite, you know, I don't want to leave the long sort of strands. I want to make sure it's chopped up so that each one's got a little bit more sphagnum around it, if you like. So make a little bit of a nest for them. Okay, and then the last medium, I guess, is tissue culture. And I'm certainly no expert on tissue culture. I've not done it. It's quite a complicated little process. There are people who do it at home, but you need a lot of sterilising and chemical type equipment. That no, I'll leave the tissue culturing to others. But you know, a lot of the plants that we see at Bunnings and therefore ultimately that end up in the trade are tissue cultured, and it's a valid propagation method, because it's essentially a clone of the plant. And you know, if a plant like this guy went into tissue culture, you know, this is a good clone of Florida. This has got a lot of this white or light green splashes on the around the midrib, which comes primarily from the pedatum parent. But this would be a good example of a plant to put into tissue culture. I was talking, Christy, to you before about that particular squamiferum cutting that I brought along today. It's got a very red petiole, extremely red. The Bunnings, the Bunnings squamiferums are green, essentially. Even the new one, the new leaves are green. Now, that's not a fault of the tissue culture process, it's a fault of the selection of the plant that was used for tissue culture in the first place.
Florida Rudolph, is that a thing? Or?
There's a lot of added marketing names given to Floridas, so yeah, it's, you know, there's a lot of tissue cultured stuff that's come out of recent batches. There's a Florida Ghost that really is just a regular Florida, and the Florida Beauty tissue cultured as well. That's not variegated. So again, it comes back to, you know, what was used originally, and getting variegation through tissue culture is not a, there's no guarantee to any of that.
The tissue culture will affect the reproductive of the plant, the reproduction. So like you go through 18 manual
No, well, look, I think that's very much dependent on what is being tissue cultured. If you tissue cultured that, yes, there's no doubt that you'd be able to set seed on it. Some of the philodendrons have been bred, some of the hybrids, like a pink princess, as an example, there's been a lot of breeding go into the selection of that plant, and they're effectively sterile. As a result, they might produce pollen, but the female parts just won't accept it. So I just go on to talk a little bit about growing conditions, and a lot of people are growing them inside their houses, and that's a fairly common way for people to start into the hobby. They may only be renting their house. They don't have an opportunity they may be in an apartment, and so growing them inside is really their only option, and so they're true house plants in that sense. I mean, philodendrons have been used as house plants, since the 1930s. So, they've been pretty, most of them are fairly bulletproof. Some of the rarer and temperamental ones, yes, difficult to grow in a household condition. But, guys like this, yes, you can grow them. Can you get them to this size of leaf inside your house? Some people can, some people never have a chance. So it's pretty much it's a good way to start into the hobby, and I guess then you can decide whether you want to go to the expense of growing a greenhouse. People get these IKEA cabinets, and you see them creating their little mini glass houses, I suppose, inside, and well done to them. Good on them. Then we look at outside under shade, and that's sort of really one of the first methods that I was growing philodendrons in the early stage was outdoors. I had a house at Brooklyn Park, and under a pergola. That was where I was growing my philodendrons. I had shade of some big trees, and I soon figured out what I could grow outside in Adelaide and what I couldn't, and the really delicate plants, the melanochrysums and the varicoseums. You can't get them through, you can get them in summer, they'll be happy in summer, but keeping them alive through winter. And that soon sort of told me by experience what are the characteristics that you need of a philodendron to be able to grow it outside in our sort of South Australian environment. And my conclusion is that it comes back to the stiffness and the thickness of the leaves, right? So the stiffer and the thicker the leaves, let's take a Congo as an example. Congo is quite a stiff and a thick leaf. A lot of the Noid, the green Noid philodendrons, there's one I think on that end table, that's got really stiff leaves. That will be fine growing outside. Most of the thaumatophyllums will grow happily outside in South Australia, with a few exceptions. The Goldii, the one with all of the fingers. In thaumatophyllum, that's now called Sprucianum, but that guy is very sensitive to the cold. Even the Stenolobums as well. Gets down too cold, their leaves will just collapse. The Bipinatophyllum, though, the big guy, that's happy. It grows in Melbourne. They can even grow it in Hobart outside. And
that one, it grows in Hobart. Where's that found in?
that's they're Brazilian and Uruguay. That part of South America is where the thaumatophyllums come from. Generally, the southern part of South America. So Brazil is really the hot spot, literally, for those thaumatophyllums. But they've got a lot of cold tolerance through that group, generally, and that makes them really good landscape plants as a result. So let me see where I was at. The next one was greenhouse. Okay, Now, some of us are lucky enough to have our own greenhouses. There's a perfect example of a really nice greenhouse that Mel's put up. Not everyone has the space or the ability. Christy's got a husband well trained to build to build greenhouses, and they come with their benefits, but they also come with their challenges. Okay, so humidity in a greenhouse is a relatively easy matter to do, because you've really got to introduce water into the greenhouse. If you're growing inside in your house, you know, unless you want mould coming off your walls and all of those sorts of things, getting your humidity up inside your house, if you lived in Brisbane or some of these other places where you can just plant them out in your garden, you don't really need to worry about your house. So the greenhouse comes with its own challenges as well, and essentially, you know, you've got shade as a primary thing, because generally most greenhouses are not shaded by trees or other structures. This guy that Mel's got here is open to the full sun, and you know, the full sun here in Renmark in the middle of summer would be pretty hot. So she's got to manage that as well. So essentially, there's pluses and there's minuses for greenhouses. The best thing is to be in the tropics. Okay, it's just there's no two ways about that. And for all of us who've spent time in the tropics looking at tropical gardens, botanic gardens, etc., up there, and you're drooling at the capacity of these guys to be able to basically just throw a stick on the ground and come back in 6 months' time and it's halfway up a tree. So, but we're much braver and probably sillier, almost certainly sillier, to be trying to do it in a Mediterranean type climate. But not sure about Mediterranean today. It's more like England, I think. It's more like we're in the UK. So that's really the challenge, and I think all of us who are growing plants successfully, we've got I'm trying to think of his name. He's got the Brazilian wife, Sean. Yeah, Sean Lee. He's got a fantastic Varicoseum growing in his bathroom, and this guy's got really nice big mature leaves, and yeah, he's got a bit of extra humidity from the showers and baths and so forth, but it's not an ideal. But you can achieve some amazing things with aroids and with, in particular, philodendrons by using them in the house and around. So the three things that are most important are humidity, warmth, and light. You've just got to have the warmth, and you've got to keep, if you have a greenhouse, you've got to heat it. Otherwise you're just going to lose half your plants. And then if we've paid good money for expensive plants, as it is, we occasionally lose some from some cold. But I've been trying to heat my greenhouse this year at a minimum of 14 to 15 centigrade. And fortunately I've got solar panels, but even so, it's a pretty decent sized bill that I end up with as a result of doing it. And that's part of the commitment, I suppose, that you make if you go into into that sort of thing. So humidity is probably the key. Walk inside Mel's greenhouse and you can just feel the humidity as you go in. A little bit about potting mix. Obviously there's different, people are using these leaker balls and things like that. I'm a bit more old school. I haven't tried any of that more, fancy propagation methods. It's more an aroid mix for me. And over the years, my mixes have gradually got more chunky and porous, I guess. And essentially, I want to be able to, if I water a plant, to not see any pooling on the surface at all. I want to see, as you water it, it's really just going straight through the profile. Philodendrons are plants that are, these are tropical rainforest plants essentially. So these sort of, these rains, pretty much every day, a philodendron growing in a tropical forest is going to get wet. Okay, so its leaves are going to get wet. Its roots, or if it's growing, up a tree as a total epiphyte, well, where its roots have got into some leaf litter and so forth. That's all going to be pretty much constantly wet. It doesn't mean that there aren't some droughts from time to time, but a drought in these forests might be a month. Not much more than that. So, the potting mix for me is from a philodendron perspective is, to have a reasonable number of these sorts of chunks. Mel looks like she's using coconut and various other bits and pieces, charcoal as well I throw in, perlite. So essentially just means by which the roots get air as well as nutrients and moisture. Fertilising, well, that's important, and we're probably all a little bit deficient in the number of times that we fertilise. There is a saying, fertilise weekly, but do it weekly, as in weekly. But I'm more, if I get it done every fortnight, I'll sort of pat myself on the back. But if it's only once a month, well then, guys, you're going to have to live with what you get. So as far as fertiliser goes, yes, there's some sort of fancy ones out there at the moment, but there's also more sort of organic, tried and true type mechanisms. When I make up my potting mix, there's always a handful of dynamic lifter that goes in there, so that when my plants are potted up, there's some dynamic lifter in there for them. And then I use a range of different liquid fertilisers. So, I'll go, nothing too fancy. I'll ask people to give me gift cards from Bunnings, and I spend it on, buying different fertilisers. So, there's the fish emulsion ones are pretty good. There's other nitrosols and so forth, but I vary them. So this time I'll do one particular fertiliser. Next time I try a different one. So while they're getting a different sort of trace elements and nutrients each time, so I figure that they're all going to get it's all going to sort of balance out in the end by doing it that way. Okay. And the other thing is support. Okay. Philodendrons are mostly climbers. Yes, there are some self-heading ones, but generally this sort of support, and the type that Mel's got here is these big bamboo ones, is actually a good idea. Now, I tend to just use the normal bamboo stakes. I've never been a what you would call a totem type person. A lot of people swear by their totems and so forth, but I look on my greenhouses that I can only have so many pots in the greenhouse. So the bigger the pot, the less plants that I can have. And if I have a big totem of sort of this diameter in the middle of the pot, well, I have to have a big pot, otherwise there's hardly any potting mix in there. It's all totem. Okay, so that is sort of a balance that I say, and the difficulty is, okay, give that another year. That guy's going to be up the top of the top of that totem. Okay, what do you do then? You know, how many times can you extend your totem, or do you, as David just said, you know, you get the Edward Scissorhands out and you snip it. So I end up, because I've got a greenhouse like Mel's, but it's a wider one and it's higher. So I end up supporting a lot of my philodendrons from the roof of the greenhouse. So essentially they're on wires essentially. And they're just kind of doing their own thing then. So because at a certain point you can't totemize them. Totems work well, I think, in a limited growing environment. But if you're looking to grow them as you know, rampant, you know, a more natural sort of environment, you end up going off the totems anyway. So that's just my personal opinion. A lot of people love them. So sort of say, well, whatever works for you. Little bit about hybrids. The first philodendron hybrid was Philodendron corsinianum, okay, which was bred in Italy in the 1880s. Okay, so we're talking about that's 140 years ago now. So philodendron breeding has been a thing for a long time. That's understood to have been a Varicoseum and Pinnatifidum hybrid. So the Pinnatifidum gives the wavy leaves, a wavy edge to the leaves, and the Varicoseum gives the red back to the Corsinianum. But then it wasn't until I think 1936 that the next recorded hybrid. It was bred by the Mander nursery in New Jersey, and Mander crossed arabescens with the plant that was at the time called Hastatum. It's not the Hastatum that we know now, which, you know, the silvery leaf with the wide ears at the end. The plant was most likely domesticum, so the non-variegated domesticum. He created the first red hybrid, and that was called Mander eanum, interestingly. And then Florida nurserymen got into hybridising philodendrons in a big way after World War II, and one of these was Bob Macaulay, and he had a nursery called Bamboo Nursery, and one of his first hybrids was this guy. Okay, so he was responsible for making Florida, and then he found Florida Beauty and so forth. Now, many of Macaulay's plants are, you know, the pretty much all of the royal ones are his. A lot of other breeders were breeding philodendrons at the same time, did quite similar plants, and that's why you'll end up with, let's take the red hybrids for example. You know, you've got your red wings, and you've got Anderson's red, you've got a whole red emerald, you've got all, you know, every nursery was doing, you know, and so that's why very similar plants, excuse me, have quite a, have different names. Can you identify them? Some of them are really hard to pick from one from the other, and it's sort of not like a species that has a very recognisable character. These are all kind of the same. So a lot of plants that you think might be this, you never can really track them to prove them. You haven't got a genetic test to be able to put them against, so it's quite difficult. So anyone who grows philodendrons can do a simple cross, essentially. You can cross either one flower on the same plant with another flower on the same plant and propagate the same plant again, or you can do a cross where you hybridise one plant with another. And, you know, there's a few people around Australia who are doing that, and that's a sort of a basic level of hybridisation. But what these guys like Macaulay did, they had a program essentially that they were looking to select for. So they were selecting for qualities like improved disease resistance to fungal diseases, as an example, because they're looking at selling these plants by the thousands as house plants. So improved resistance to those things, reducing the legginess, the climbability. There's actually a Florida compactor that was bred by Macaulay, and instead of using pedatum as one parent, he used quercifolium, and that reduced the internode lengths on it, so that compacted the plant down. A lot of these breeders used Wendlandii. Wendlandii is a bird's nest type philodendron, and that was used by a lot of these breeders to essentially stop that legginess that would be a problem as a house plant. So you look at your philodendrons like Imperial Red, Imperial Green, all of those Wendimbi, they've all had Wendlandii used in the breeding line. And what these guys like Macaulay would do is that they would start with a cross, they'd grow out and then select as the ones that they wanted as best. Then they would cross that again with some. They might then cross that with Wendlandii, and so there'd be a whole lot. So they're really complex hybrids. These things, they've been backbred, crossed, selected, and eventually, they might come up with a plant. But it's after 5-10 years worth of breeding and selection and back crossing, and then they eventually come up with the plant and that's where things like Pink Princess have come from. A big breeding line. If you take the original Arabescens, which has, it's called the blushing philodendron because it's got a very sort of pale darkness about it, but that was enough red for these breeders to eventually select to get to plants like Black Cardinal, Black Knight, Royal Queen, the really dark purple colours. They just through a process of breeding and selection and then breeding again, and they've been able to create those. And then things that have got red and orange and all sorts of colours are all about selection.
So in the tropics, how long does it take to go from seed to like flowering maturity?
I would think that it would be, based on what I know about growing them in my greenhouse, I would think maybe 3 or 4 years.
Oh, right.
They're fairly quick. They're fairly quick growers. So I took a melanochrysum from a small plant to one with really large leaves in about 5 years, and that has flowered. So yeah, I imagine in the growing in the tropics that they can do that. So I just come back onto the last, like the Imperial Red philodendron, that was used to cross with Congo. So the green Congo and Imperial Red were crossed together to create the Rojo Congo. So that's where the red came into it. They used an old existing philodendron to give it that, to bring that red colour into those plants. So a couple more items and then I'll finish. I talked briefly about forms before. So this is not a true species, so it's probably not the best example, but I wanted to just touch on Varicoseum. Now, the form of Varicoseum that we see here right in front of us, that's been in Australia for, well, probably 50, 60 years or more, okay? Where it was originally collected in South America, who knows? What elevation it was collected at? High-ish, I think. But we've got no collection information about that. So that to us is what Varicoseum is. But if you go into South and Central America and travel through it, the people who have done that, Bruce Dunstan from you will have met Bruce from Queensland. He's made a lot of collecting trips into South America, and Varicoseum is ubiquitous. Okay, it's everywhere. We think of it as a rare sort of jewel, but no, it's everywhere in all different habitats, even from near sea level to that 2,500 metre collection that was made, and all the way from Peru through to Nicaragua, okay? So we're talking about a massive geographical range, a massive vertical range. So we've started to see into America and other places, and into Asia as well, collections that are coming out of Ecuador, okay? Ecuador has a number of companies that are exporting aroids, some great aroids. Their naming is a little bit suspect in time, but they generally have collected a whole lot of different forms of Varicoseum from around their immediate area and other parts of Ecuador, given them names generally for the locality, and there may be 50 or 60 different identifiable forms that have names. That literally is the tip of the iceberg. If you were to travel through all of the range of Varicoseum and document it, I suspect you'd come up with thousands, okay? They're all Varicoseum as per the general definition of the species, but you take, there's a little ground cover form, and there's ones with leaves that are, nearly as big as me. So they all make the species. So if you put one side by side, well, you say, well, they can't be the same species, and that's what we've kind of got to get our heads around, is understanding what makes a species and what doesn't. We're all the same species here, and look at us. Some are tall, some are thin, some are not so thin, me. Some are wide, some have got blonde hair, some have got not much hair. Some have got grey hair, some have got dark hair, We're all, some have got red hair. But we're all different, right? We're all different. Now, you stand us next to each other, you notice the differences. Now, our eyes are kind of trained to do that. But we look at differences in plants and we go, well, that can't be the same. That's not the same. We've got to kind of just broaden our thinking a little bit. And that's, we look at the discussion that's happened around the Atabapoense plants, and a discussion of, well, that one is different from that, so that must be a hybrid. Must be a hybrid with Billiettii, because it looks a bit different than the other one, and it looks a bit more like Billiettii. So someone has invented a hybrid that no one's documented, right? It just happened, right? So there's things like that challenge the thinking of people, that if this plant looks a bit more like that plant, well, it must be a hybrid. Now, that's not to say that there aren't natural hybrids, and there are examples of them that occur in nature. But I think, just as a general rule, we need to think a little bit more about the number of forms that happen out there. I've touched on the thaumatophyllum and the meconostigma debate. That was my last note. Thanks to your question, I've already covered that one. So that's really it, as a bit of a rundown of the genus Philodendron, and hopefully I've answered your questions. And if there are any more questions anyone's got, throw them now or hit me over lunch. Mel, is it lunchtime now? Just about. Okay. Mel, have you got any questions? Go, Dave. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, go on.
Fire and lethal is like a plant's defense mechanism. So it's feeding a predator to look after
Mm-hmm.
the plant. So is that correct?
That is correct. So it's an anti-herbivore.
And the ants are
Yeah,
going to go away.
it's really the plant having a mechanism to support the ants, or encourage the ants onto the plant, that the ants are not going to hurt the plant, but they're going to drive off predators like slugs, for example. We're talking about slugs before. Not that I don't imagine they have slugs in South America, but the sort of leaf-eating things, Yes.
same
Mm-hmm.
nectar,
Yes.
they
The plant the plant
they go
is
straight to the plant.
the plant is providing it as a resource, and not this is not an aroid wide thing. This is not. I'm not sure that there are any other genera apart from philodendrons that do these, and some philodendrons are literally covered in them. Caudatum is one. The leaves are, and petioles. Pinnatifidum is another. Just chock-a-block full of them.
So if the nectar isn't cleared off, do they get what's that grey mould?
Like
Sooty
sooty
mould?
mould.
Look, I don't know. All you usually see is a little bubble, almost. You just see a little dome of the nectar sitting there, and I suspect it kind of doesn't until that's disturbed by the ant and it sucks it out. It maybe doesn't. It's not like it's continually producing a massive amount that it's sort of dripping down the plant. It's really just this little bubble, and I imagine if the ants are licking it or whatever ants do to things, then it might produce some more, stimulate it. I know you've got a question.
At the nursery that I work at, we get a lot of phillos in, like a lot of congos and stuff from Queensland, and they have what we call fungal spots.
Yes.
What is that? How do you avoid that?
Oh, well, look, I mean, fungal diseases come about essentially from
You know what I'm talking about?
yeah, they're just little dot. Yeah, you get little dots on it. It is a fungus, and essentially, I mean, fungal diseases grow in humid and still conditions, so the air movement will help with that. But otherwise, you've just got to treat them, and not a full bottle on what sort of. I think there's different fungicides that you can apply.
Get the fungus ID to make it easier.
Yeah.
Otherwise you could be treating it with something that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are the best species to grow in Adelaide without a greenhouse?
Without a greenhouse, okay. Well, as I've sort of alluded to before, my key is the leaf stiffness and the thickness of the leaves. The more, and that really means that, take this guy, which is the hybrid of Plougmanii and Tenu. This guy's got quite thin leaves. I wouldn't put that outside. Wind is also your enemy, growing plants outside. So the leaves get sort of thrown around, and the stiffer and stronger they are, the more that they resist that. But also I think that it's just a stronger leaf, less prone to cold damage. So I'd be, the Congos are an example. The green, what we call noids, the no identification ones. What else can we grow outside? There's certainly Crassinervium. It's got quite a stiff leaf. I've grown that outside. The Thaumatophyllums that we talked about before, you're growing Bipenifolium outside. That's sort of a reasonably stiffish leaf. Mel, what's your experience of any others?
Find a philodendron in my outside garden.
No. Well, that's
Yeah.
yeah,
Fortunately, we go one extreme to the other, so.
yeah.
We actually have a talk coming up in next year on what plants can go, what phillies can grow in cold climate by our president Aaron. He's going to do a talk, and so hopefully we'll be able to get more.
Yeah,
Growing in.
that should be good. So it's a little bit of trial and error, really.
Yeah.
I had Jerry Horn survive outside where Florida couldn't.
Yeah. Well, the Jerry Horn again has got that. It's got that stiffer. Yeah. Well, look, it's the Jerry Horn parentage is a little bit mystic. You know, like some of these hybrids, what is actually in them is unrecorded. But yeah, that certainly would be one that you could definitely grow outside. So if there are no more questions, I think maybe we could think about getting ourselves ready for lunch. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for having me.